In this segment, I'm going to be talking about change in the 1970s, but of a cultural nature. In the last segment, I talked a bit about the economics of the 70s and the travails that Americans were beginning to experience in the 1970s that led them to a certain amount of doubt about the ability of the United States to sustain its position in the world, to sustain the lifestyle to which people had grown accustomed. On the cultural side, you have a situation where the themes of the 1960s continue, they persist, but at the same time, they will be transformed. So that perhaps the best way to put it is some of the idealism of the 60s is transferred in new avenues and new directions, but overall reform, what you might call the sort of march toward greater freedom in many people's minds, it persists. At the same time in the 1970s, we really began to see the outlines of the larger reaction to the campaigns, to the protests of the 1960s. And so the 1970s is really a very important decade full of tension and a tension about the definition of American culture. To start out, understand that the protests over Vietnam persists into the 1970s. When Richard Nixon took office, there were protests that occurred early in his first administration at Cornell, at Berkeley, Wisconsin, and scores of other college campuses. There were bloody demonstrations and sit-ins. In October of 1969, there was the Student Democratic Society riot in Chicago that occurred. In November, 500,000 people gathered at the Washington Monument to call for an end to American involvement in Vietnam and an end to the war. This was a day known as Moratorium Day. The point being, it's not as if this simply goes away. There would be some extraordinarily severe incidents as well. One of them, of course, is Kent State. April 30th, 1970, President Nixon announced the expansion of the war into Cambodia. On May the 4th, there were student protests at Kent State over the expansion of the war. And during those protests, National Guardsmen who had been supplied with live ammunition fired into the crowd, killing 4 students and wounding others. This is on a college campus where parents were sending their children expecting a certain level of safety. But the incident suggests the level of tension and what could potentially go wrong, as it did on May 14th at Jackson State in Mississippi. Jackson State, an all-black college at the time, 2 students killed, 9 wounded during protests. What we see in part is not merely a sort of growing tendency toward violence on college campuses, but a growing radicalization in the streets. One of the groups to emerge in the late 60s and early 70s out of SDS and out of the larger campus protests was a more radical subunit of SDS known as the Weather Underground, and the participants were often called the Weathermen. This group was organized in 1969 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, mostly in response to what had happened at the Democratic Convention in 1968 and arrests that followed. This was an effort to protest the arrest and trial of the so-called Chicago 7, who were the anointed ringleaders, certainly by police officials, the ringleaders of the unrest in Chicago. And the Weather Underground would become involved in bombings. And the last time we talked about that, of course, we were talking really about the Red Scare of the post-World War I era, and we talked about the Haymarket riots and anarchists. It's not as if this kind of activity is entirely new in American history, but for sort of mainstream America in the 1970s, it was certainly troubling that it should appear when it did. In terms of civil rights, the campaign, the effort continues as well. The effects of the downturn in the American economic situation were to be hardest felt by those least able really to accommodate the changes. The people who were already struggling in American society were the people who would be hurt first and hardest. But the campaign for civil rights persists. One area of great importance is feminism. The focus by the late 1960s in feminism in some ways is becoming more radical, calling for greater change, more systemic change, not merely, limited reforms, not merely focused on the workplace. But we began to talk about things like language itself. And language is extraordinarily important. It has cultural value. Words matter. What you call someone, what they call themselves, it matters. And so we begin to see gradually the adoption in language in America of terms like chairperson over chairman. Traditionally, the gender bias there had been toward the male being in a position of authority. But this little subtle change is a reflection of the effort of feminists to begin changing the system itself, not merely the decorations, but the system itself in terms of how women were thought about. So fireman becomes fireperson, women becomes acceptable. It becomes less acceptable to use the oft-used term of the 1950s, shows like Mad Men, girls, right? What are the girls doing tonight? Would be far less acceptable. Another aspect of the change is the claim of control over the body, particularly when it comes to sexual reproduction, which is an outgrowth of the larger sexual revolution. And then there are going to be workplace and very practical gains for women in terms of acceptance. In 1970, we see the Women's Strike for Equality, which is the largest demonstration to date at that time over women's rights, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of suffrage. 50 years on, women are reconsidering what change the vote in particular had really meant for them. And it was an effort then to really bring to the fore those issues at the heart of modern feminism. In practical terms, we would see these changes as far as regard for gender in American society being played out in court cases like 1971's Reed versus Reed, in which the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment was determined by the Supreme Court to apply in matters of sex. In fact, in this particular case, the question was whether a woman could act to probate a will, and traditionally that had not been the case. The suit went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that sex, gender, could not be used as a basis for denying a citizen access to that position of authority. 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment is sent to the states for ratification. This amendment was an effort to make part of the Constitution, to embed in the Constitution the freedoms that women had won over the years. Something we don't think as much about, perhaps, but it's very important on college campuses, of course, is Title IX. College campuses, high school, and athletics. The idea that there should be equality for women's teams. That's a very practical outgrowth of the protests and the campaigns for recognition of women's rights. But perhaps one of the most important pieces of legislation, I shouldn't even say legislation, one of the most important court cases to come out of the women's rights movement in the early 1970s is well known to most people, and that's 1973's Roe versus Wade. This is a court case in which the Supreme Court declared a right to privacy, that women have a right to access abortion, certainly in the first trimester, and that right is protected under the Constitution. This goes back to the question of whether or not women have control over their own bodies, whether they have the final say-so in what's done to them or by them as citizens. Now, the thing is, this court case, Roe versus Wade, would become a key touch point in the cultural struggles to follow. When I say a key touch point, I mean that in terms of women's rights, but also in terms of reaction, this case, Roe v. Wade, would continue to fuel the so-called culture wars for decades to come.